From the vaults of secrecy, where history was meant to remain buried, 5 files have surfaced, dust-stained, redacted, and marked with the warning, "Eyes only." They whisper of shadows cast during the Second World War, shadows governments swore to erase from the record. Each fragment, each torn report and intercepted telegram tells of atrocities, betrayals, and concealed operations too disturbing for the public to know. The war may have ended in 1945, but what followed in its wake was a struggle not of armies, but of silence. We were told only part of the story, the victories, the heroics, the liberation, but beneath the surface lies another narrative, written in blood, ash, and secrecy. Why were certain massacres erased from testimony? Why did entire military missions vanish from official memory? And why were some of the war's most monstrous crimes rewarded with protection rather than punishment? Tonight, these forbidden archives are opened, and their words will haunt you. 5 mysteries, 5 cover-ups, 5 disturbing truths that were never meant to see the light. Stay with us, and ask yourself, what else have they hidden from you? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because this silence must finally be broken. Chapter 1. Classified Files of Operation. Highjump. The winter of 1946 should have been a season of closure. The world, still staggering from the devastation of World War II, was desperate to heal, to rebuild cities reduced to rubble, and to mend the psychological wounds inflicted by 6 years of relentless bloodshed. Yet in the shadows, another war was quietly being waged. One that was not fought with infantry and tanks across Europe's ruined landscapes, but in secrecy, over information and territory the public would never hear about. The operation was called Highjump. Officially, it was a United States Navy expedition to Antarctica, one of the largest missions of its kind ever launched. What made this mission so unusual was not just its scale, but what was omitted from its public narrative. At its core, Highjump raised more questions than it answered, and the missing files surrounding it have left a haunting gap in the historical record. Led by Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd, a celebrated polar explorer with decades of experience, the mission departed in late 1946 with what seemed to be an extraordinary level of military commitment for a so-called training exercise. Task Force 68, as it was officially designated, included no fewer than 13 ships, an aircraft carrier, destroyer escorts, and submarines. Over 4,700 men were deployed alongside fleets of aircraft, reconnaissance planes, bombers, and helicopters. According to public documents, the aim was to establish the Antarctic research base Little America IV, to test equipment in polar conditions, and to train personnel. But for many analysts, the sheer magnitude of firepower, logistics, and secrecy involved suggested a mission with far more strategic intent. The choice of timing has long puzzled historians. The United States, fresh from victory in the Pacific, was rapidly transitioning into its Cold War posture against the Soviet Union. The atomic bomb had already demonstrated America's new dominance. Yet Antarctica suddenly became a focus of urgency. Why? Declassified fragments from Navy memoranda suggest that intelligence indicated former Nazi operatives had retreated southward at the end of the war. Among them, the legend of Base 211, a supposed German stronghold hidden beneath the Antarctic ice, continued to circulate in intelligence circles. Captured U-boat records revealed strange voyages to the South Atlantic during 1944, some carrying heavy cargo under mysterious conditions. Whether these were myths propagated by fleeing Nazis or evidence of genuine plans, the Americans were determined to investigate. Byrd's mission, it seemed, was less about science and more about denying Germany, or any other power, an opportunity to establish a strategic presence at the bottom of the world. Yet the expedition was abruptly cut short. Planned to last 6 to 8 months, Operation Highjump was terminated after just 2. Byrd and his fleet returned stateside in February 1947 under a shroud of secrecy, bringing with them a trail of casualties and unexplained damages. Several aircraft were lost, ships returned with scorched hulls, and dozens of sailors were quietly reported dead. The official explanations range from accidents to environmental hazards, but buried within the files are conflicting testimonies, accounts of aircraft encountering strange aerial craft, that moved with speeds and maneuvers beyond anything known at the time. One Chilean newspaper published remarks attributed to Byrd himself, claiming that the United States had confronted a new enemy that could fly from pole to pole with incredible velocity. Those comments were quickly censored, withdrawn from public circulation, and dismissed by U.S. officials. Yet Soviet intelligence took them seriously, compiling their own dossiers that tied Highjump to advanced German research projects abandoned after 1945. The secrecy surrounding the operation deepened further during the Cold War. As tensions rose with the Soviet Union, the Antarctic suddenly became a no-man's land of suspicion. The 1959 Antarctic Treaty, signed by the major powers, prohibited military activity on the continent. But by then, rumors of hidden bases and forbidden technologies had taken root in the global consciousness. Files on Highjump were selectively declassified, often heavily redacted, with vast swathes of text blacked out. What remained was a sanitized account: harsh weather, logistical failures, and routine accidents. But naval intelligence reports hinted otherwise. In the National Archives, a restricted folder, once marked top secret, and only partially released decades later, contained reports of radar contacts that did not match any known aircraft profile, as well as missing reconnaissance footage never explained in later inventories. Perhaps most disturbingly, Operation Highjump was not an isolated anomaly. Parallel investigations conducted by British forces on the Antarctic Peninsula during Operation Tabarin had already revealed German activity in the South Atlantic in 1944. Several U-boats had surrendered months after Germany's capitulation, fueling speculation of missions beyond Europe. While evidence of a vast subterranean fortress remains unproven, the persistence of missing files, the unusual scale of the U.S. deployment, and the abrupt end to Highjump together suggest that something was encountered, something not meant to be publicly acknowledged. Rear Admiral Byrd himself never spoke openly about the full scope of the mission again. He would later return to Antarctica under more conventional circumstances, but the legacy of Highjump followed him. His sudden death in 1957, before he could publish a detailed memoir, only deepened suspicions. Scholars have long debated whether his reported statements about a new enemy were exaggerated, misquoted, or censored deliberately. What cannot be dismissed is the fact that hundreds of pages from his logs and post-expedition interviews remain missing, misfiled, or classified under unrelated designations. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act have yielded fragments, but the most sensitive documents remain locked away under national security justifications. What then was the true purpose of Operation Highjump? Was it a military test disguised as exploration, a preemptive show of force in the emerging Cold War, or an attempt to eradicate remnants of the Third Reich in one of the planet's most inhospitable corners? The incomplete record leaves us grasping at shadows. All we know with certainty is this: a mission launched with unprecedented resources ended abruptly, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions, redacted files, and the lingering sense that the full truth was deliberately silenced. In the words of one intelligence analyst reviewing the scattered documents decades later, the greatest mysteries of the Second World War are not those fought on the battlefield, but those erased from its aftermath. Operation Highjump remains one of those mysteries, a file stamped classified, its secrets buried beneath layers of ice, secrecy, and silence. Chapter 2: The Erased Massacre of Nemmersdorf. The fall of 1944 was marked by desperation and brutality across the Eastern Front. Hitler's Reich was collapsing, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly, and entire villages stood in the path of a juggernaut bent on total victory. Yet among the countless tragedies of that time, one event stands apart. Not for its scale, but for its deliberate erasure from history. The massacre at Nemmersdorf, a village in East Prussia, was one of the first documented atrocities committed by the advancing Soviet army on German soil. On October 21, 1944, Soviet troops of the 2nd Guards Tank Corps entered Nemmersdorf. What followed, according to survivors, was an orgy of violence that defied comprehension. Civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were tortured, mutilated, and killed in ways meant to terrorize. Yet after the war, what should have been central to war crimes? Discussions were systematically buried under layers of propaganda, denial, and Cold War silence. Eyewitness accounts describe scenes so harrowing that even hardened Wehrmacht officers who arrived after the Soviets withdrew were shaken. Reports mention women nailed to barn doors, elderly men beaten to death in the streets, and children killed in acts of cruelty designed to instill fear. Survivors who managed to flee described mass rapes, often followed by executions, with some victims tied to wagons or farm equipment before being shot. While Nazi authorities immediately exploited the atrocity for propaganda purposes, releasing photographs and reports to stoke resistance among German civilians, post-war Allied documents tell a more complex story. British intelligence officers under Operation Keystone collected evidence, including photographs and testimonies from both German civilians and captured Soviet soldiers. These files, however, disappeared into classified archives. What filtered into the public sphere was fragmentary, distorted, and often dismissed as Nazi exaggeration. The erasure of Nemmersdorf was not accidental. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Allies needed the Soviet Union as both partner and rival. As the Nuremberg trials began, prosecutors carefully selected which atrocities to highlight, prioritizing crimes committed by the Nazis while minimizing Soviet offenses. Internal memoranda between American and British legal teams reveal a calculated decision. Pursuing Soviet war crimes would fracture the fragile alliance needed to shape post-war Europe. Nemmersdorf, though horrific, was sidelined. Witnesses who testified about the massacre were either ignored or quietly discredited, their statements omitted from trial transcripts. Even when German civilians pressed for recognition, their voices were silenced under the justification that they were tainted by association with Nazi propaganda. Soviet denials were categorical. Official communiqué dismissed the entire event as a fabrication, a lie concocted by Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda to vilify the Red Army. Soviet archives, opened briefly in the early 1990s, contained no official mention of Nemmersdorf, only references to enemy misinformation campaigns. Yet the photographic evidence collected by both German and British investigators tells another story. Though many images were destroyed or disappeared, a handful resurfaced decades later, depicting corpses in civilian clothing arranged in ways that corroborated the eyewitness reports. Forensic examinations conducted on exhumed remains in the late 1940s supported claims of execution and mutilation, though these findings were never entered into the official record. The silencing of Nemmersdorf also had a psychological component. As Germany lay in ruins after 1945, the narrative of German suffering was considered dangerous. Western governments feared that emphasizing atrocities committed against German civilians would shift attention away from the unprecedented crimes of the Holocaust and the Nazi regime. Scholars in the 1950s and 60s often avoided the subject entirely, dismissing it as contaminated history. In East Germany, the Soviet-controlled state enforced silence with even greater rigor. To acknowledge Soviet crimes was unthinkable. Instead, history books painted the Red Army exclusively as liberators, heroes who freed Europe from fascism. What remains most disturbing is not just the massacre itself, but the deliberate decision to erase it. German families who lost relatives in Nemmersdorf were denied recognition, compensation, or even the dignity of remembrance. Survivors carried their testimonies in silence, often passing them down only through whispered family stories. When the Iron Curtain fell and historians revisited the Eastern Front with greater freedom, fragments of the truth began to emerge. Declassified British and American files hinted at the existence of suppressed reports, including one dossier that catalogued over 200 photographs from Nemmersdorf. To this day, only a fraction of those images have been released. The massacre also reveals a disturbing truth about the politics of memory. The victors of war write its history, deciding what is remembered and what is forgotten. In the case of Nemmersdorf, political expediency outweighed the pursuit of justice. The Allies could not afford to tarnish the image of the Red Army at a moment when they needed Soviet cooperation, first to end the war and later to confront the emerging Cold War. For the victims, this meant eternal silence. For the world, it meant that one of the first atrocities committed on German soil during the Soviet advance remained hidden, overshadowed, and denied. Today, scholars who attempt to reconstruct the events of October 21, 1944, face a battlefield of competing narratives. Some accuse revisionists of inflating the atrocity to fuel modern political agendas, while others argue that the massacre's suppression proves the scale was even greater than reported. The truth likely lies in between, but what is undeniable is that something horrific took place in Nemmersdorf. The conflicting testimonies, missing files, and deliberate erasures leave us with shadows rather than clarity. But shadows speak. They tell us of a village consumed by violence, of civilians sacrificed to the chaos of total war, and of a truth governments deemed too dangerous for the world to confront. The name Nemmersdorf has since been erased from the maps. The village was absorbed into Soviet territory after 1945, renamed Mayakovskoye, and its German population expelled or killed. The land remembers, even if the official record does not. Beneath new buildings and altered landscapes, the soil still holds the remnants of that October day, and perhaps that is the final silence governments sought to enforce, that the ground itself would be the only witness left. Nemmersdorf remains not just a massacre, but a warning. History is not merely what happened, but what we are allowed to remember. Chapter 3: Forbidden Experiments of Unit 731. In the vast, frigid expanse of northeastern China, amid the occupied territory of Manchuria, the Japanese Empire constructed what they called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. To the outside world, it was a research facility dedicated to hygiene and medical science. But inside the barbed wire in the compound near Pingfang, it bore a far more sinister name whispered among prisoners and guards alike: Unit 731. Between 1936 and 1945, this facility became the site of some of the most disturbing war crimes in human history. Experiments so grotesque, so devoid of morality, that for decades their very existence was denied. And when the truth emerged, it carried with it an even more disturbing revelation. Rather than face justice, many of the perpetrators were shielded, protected, and integrated into new networks of power by the same governments that publicly condemned them. The origins of Unit 731 lay in Japan's obsession with biological warfare. General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but ruthless physician and microbiologist, convinced the Imperial Army that mastering bacteria and viruses could yield weapons more devastating than conventional bombs. With the full backing of the Emperor's military, Ishii oversaw the creation of an expansive complex near Harbin, stretching over 6 square kilometers, with more than 150 buildings and a staff of nearly 3,000. To the outside world, the base was hidden behind layers of secrecy, euphemisms, and propaganda. To those within its walls, it was a living nightmare. Prisoners, known euphemistically as logs or maruta, were brought into the facility by the thousands. They were Chinese civilians accused of resistance activities, Korean dissidents, Mongolian captives, and later Allied prisoners of war, including Russians and Americans. Inside, they were subjected to human experimentation of a scale rarely documented in modern history. Victims were deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid. Frostbite tests were carried out by immersing limbs in freezing temperatures until flesh froze solid, then studying the effects of rewarming, often by striking the frozen tissue with sticks. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia, organs removed while the victims were still conscious. In one experiment, prisoners were exposed to bombs filled with ceramic flechettes dipped in bacteria, designed to test the spread of infection. In another, entire villages were contaminated with poisoned wells, leading to mass civilian deaths far beyond the walls of the compound. These were not isolated events. Unit 731 was part of a vast network of biological warfare divisions, including Units 100, 1644, and 1855, spread across occupied territories. Together, they formed the backbone of Japan's secret campaign to weaponize disease. Field tests were carried out across Manchuria and China, with planes dispersing plague-infested fleas and crop pathogens over farmland. In Zhejiang province, entire communities were wiped out by outbreaks deliberately engineered by Ishii's team. Estimates of deaths caused by these experiments range into the hundreds of thousands. And yet, as horrifying as these atrocities were, what followed after Japan's surrender in 1945 is perhaps even more chilling. When the war ended, many assumed that Unit 731's leaders would be tried alongside their German counterparts at Nuremberg, facing justice for crimes against humanity. Instead, the opposite occurred. General Ishii and his staff were quietly approached by American intelligence. Declassified CIA and US Army documents reveal a secret deal. In exchange for their research data, the scientists of Unit 731 would be granted immunity. The rationale was simple but disturbing. America, now entering the Cold War against the Soviet Union, could not allow such information to fall into Russian hands. The biological warfare knowledge gathered through torture and death was deemed too valuable to destroy. While Nazi doctors like Joseph Mengele became synonymous with inhumanity, Ishii escaped trial altogether. Many of his subordinates went on to secure prominent careers in medicine, academia, and even corporate industries in post-war Japan. Some became directors of hospitals and pharmaceutical companies. Their dark expertise was buried beneath layers of official silence. In contrast, the Soviets, who captured several lower-ranking Unit 731 scientists, held their own trials in Khabarovsk in 1949. There, testimony confirmed the scale of atrocities, including plans to unleash biological weapons on the American West Coast using balloon bombs. But the Western world dismissed the Khabarovsk trials as communist propaganda, choosing instead to preserve the secrecy of its bargain with Ishii. The victims of Unit 731 were erased twice, first by their deaths, then by the deliberate suppression of their suffering. Survivors' families were never compensated, their identities often lost amid destroyed records. Testimonies from former guards and Japanese soldiers, who confessed decades later, painted a grim picture of systematic dehumanization. Prisoners were stripped of names, reduced to numbers, and executed once their usefulness ended. Bodies were incinerated, bones crushed to dust to leave no trace. Even today, excavation sites around Pingfang continue to yield evidence. Bones, surgical instruments, fragments of incinerated remains, proof of crimes once denied. The post-war concealment extended beyond Japan. At Fort Detrick in Maryland, America's premier biological warfare research facility, Ishii's findings were integrated into classified programs throughout the 1950s and 60s. Research papers, stripped of their origin, circulated among military scientists. The irony was staggering. Data obtained through mass murder became a foundation for modern biological defense. In return, Ishii lived comfortably until his death in 1959, never facing a tribunal, never uttering public contrition. His associates thrived, while the world remained largely ignorant. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s that Unit 731's story began to surface in mainstream discourse, thanks to Japanese activists, Chinese survivors, and declassification of certain US files. Yet even then, governments were reluctant to acknowledge the full extent of the cover-up. Japan's official stance wavered between silence and half-hearted recognition, often downplaying the numbers or questioning testimonies. The United States, when pressed, admitted to granting immunity, but justified it as a necessity of the Cold War. Meanwhile, survivors aged and died, their voices fading, their justice denied. The forbidden experiments of Unit 731 remain a chilling testament not only to the depths of human cruelty, but also to the corrosive power of secrecy. It is one thing for atrocities to be committed in war. It is another for victorious nations to protect the perpetrators for strategic advantage. The victims were sacrificed not only to science, but to geopolitics, their suffering erased from textbooks and denied in courtrooms. And yet the soil of Manchuria remembers. In Pingfang, remnants of the complex still stand, crumbling buildings, rusting gates, and memorial stones erected by those who refuse to let silence prevail. They serve as stark reminders that truth can be buried, but never fully extinguished. The files may remain classified, the data may be hidden, but the blood that seeped into the frozen ground of Unit 731 still cries out, demanding to be heard. Chapter 4: Hidden Pact Behind Dresden's Flames. February 13th, 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its end. Hitler's Reich was collapsing under the combined weight of Soviet and Western offensives, and surrender seemed inevitable. Yet, as the Allies prepared their final push, one city, famed for its cultural splendor and lack of heavy military industry, was chosen for a campaign of destruction unlike anything seen before. Dresden, the jewel of Saxony, was reduced to rubble and ash in a matter of days. The official explanation was simple. It was a vital transport hub supporting the German war effort. But declassified files, buried communiques, and internal memoranda paint a darker picture. Dresden was not just targeted for strategic necessity, it was sacrificed in a calculated display of power. A hidden pact designed to send a message not only to Germany, but to the Soviet Union itself. The attack began on the evening of February 13th, when 245 British Lancaster bombers roared into the skies over Dresden. They released their payloads with precision, igniting fires that consumed entire neighborhoods. Hours later, a second wave followed, this time even heavier, dropping incendiaries that fanned the flames into a firestorm. Within 24 hours, the city's historic center, filled with civilians, refugees, and wounded soldiers, was an inferno. American bombers arrived the following day, striking rail yards and bridges, but also delivering further devastation to the already burning city. When the flames finally subsided, tens of thousands were dead. Men, women, and children incinerated, suffocated, or buried alive in collapsed shelters. The official death toll remains disputed, but even conservative estimates place it above 25,000. Some post-war German records suggested much higher numbers, particularly given the influx of refugees fleeing the Red Army's advance. At the time, Allied leaders justified the raid as militarily necessary. Dresden was described as a vital communications hub, a city supplying German troops on the Eastern Front. But internal documents, declassified decades later, contradict this narrative. A 1945 report from the British Air Ministry acknowledged Dresden's lack of heavy armaments and military factories, admitting the city had not previously been subjected to major bombing due to limited strategic importance. Yet Winston Churchill himself, in a memo written shortly after the bombing, referred to the attack as an act of terror bombing designed to break German morale. That memo was quickly withdrawn, replaced by a sanitized statement that reinforced the official line. What was Churchill trying to hide? The answer may lie in the geopolitical reality of February 1945. The Yalta Conference had just concluded, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin negotiated the post-war map of Europe. Tensions were already rising between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, as both sides jockeyed for influence in Germany and beyond. Declassified US Army Air Force files suggest Dresden was chosen not only to cripple German infrastructure, but to demonstrate the overwhelming destructive capacity of Anglo-American air power. Stalin's forces were advancing rapidly toward Berlin, and the West wanted a vivid reminder that they, too, could annihilate cities in a single stroke. In essence, Dresden was both a military operation and a political message, a warning wrapped in fire. What makes this revelation more disturbing is the coordinated silence that followed. Civilian casualties were systematically downplayed in public statements. US General Carl Spaatz referred to the mission as a success, while British Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, nicknamed Bomber Harris, dismissed criticism by claiming the Germans had started the practice of bombing cities. Yet in private correspondence, Allied officers expressed unease. One letter from a Royal Air Force navigator, later discovered in personal papers, described Dresden as a city of flame and horror, filled with women and children, and not soldiers. His words echoed those of American reporters on the ground, who were pressured to soften their dispatches or risk censorship. The effort to erase the moral ambiguity of Dresden was deliberate, calculated, and remarkably effective. The Soviet Union, ironically, said little about the bombing at the time. Stalin welcomed the destruction of German strongholds, but Soviet intelligence recognized the underlying message. The Western Allies had no hesitation in unleashing devastation of this scale. The timing, coming so soon after Yalta, reinforced suspicions that the bombing was meant to remind Moscow of Anglo-American strength in the post-war order. Later, Soviet propaganda would use Dresden as an example of Western cruelty, but at the critical moment, silence prevailed. A silence that suggests a tacit understanding between the supposed allies. The cultural loss alone was catastrophic. Dresden was known as the Florence on the Elbe, home to architectural masterpieces, art galleries, and centuries of history. In one night, the Frauenkirche collapsed in flames, the Zwinger Palace was gutted, and priceless collections were reduced to ashes. Survivors described the firestorm in apocalyptic terms. The heat grew so intense that asphalt melted in the streets, sucking people into the flames. In shelters, oxygen was consumed so rapidly that entire families suffocated without ever touching fire. Thousands of bodies were reduced to ashes, leaving behind no trace but shadows seared into stone walls. Why then has Dresden remained shrouded in silence compared to other wartime tragedies? Part of the answer lies in post-war politics. The the Allies were eager to construct a narrative of moral superiority, emphasizing liberation, justice, and reconstruction. Acknowledging Dresden as a deliberate act of terror undermined that narrative. Files were sealed, reports rewritten, and dissenting voices marginalized. Churchill himself later distanced from Harris, refusing to grant him a peerage after the war, quietly acknowledging the moral stain. Yet the public narrative remained fixed. Dresden was a military necessity, nothing more. Only decades later, with the release of declassified archives, did the truth begin to surface. Documents from the British National Archives and the US Army reveal explicit planning for firestorm conditions, the targeting of civilian quarters, and the intent to cripple German morale rather than military output. These revelations have forced historians to re-evaluate Dresden, not as an unfortunate byproduct of war, but as a calculated act. And behind it all, the shadow of a hidden pact emerges, a decision made not solely for victory over Germany, but for positioning against the Soviet Union. The Massacre of Dresden by fire remains one of the most disturbing episodes of World War II. Not because war had not already consumed countless lives, but because of the deliberate deception that followed. Civilians were not merely victims of bombs, but of silence, erased from official memory to preserve political alliances. The destruction of Dresden was as much about shaping the Cold War as it was about ending the Second World War. And in that hidden motive lies its darkest truth. A city sacrificed not to defeat Nazism, but to prepare for the next conflict, waiting just beyond the ashes. Chapter 5. The Disappeared Convoy of Operation Tiger. On the morning of April 28, 1944, the English Channel became the stage for one of the most disastrous and least acknowledged tragedies of the Second World War. Just weeks before D-Day, the Allies were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history. To test the coordination required for Operation Overlord, the US Army and Navy, alongside the Royal Navy, staged a massive rehearsal on the shores of Devon, England. The exercise was codenamed Operation Tiger. Its purpose was to simulate the Normandy landings, complete with live ammunition, amphibious landings, and naval bombardments. Yet, what was meant to be a dress rehearsal turned into a catastrophe so grave that entire families would be lied to for decades. Nearly 1,000 American soldiers lost their lives, not in Normandy, but on their own practice ground. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was deliberate, a cover-up orchestrated at the highest levels of command to protect the secrecy of D-Day at any cost. Operation Tiger began with a series of amphibious landings at Slapton Sands, a coastal area chosen for its striking resemblance to Utah Beach in Normandy. The village of Slapton had been evacuated months earlier, its residents displaced to make way for military training. Soldiers of the US 4th Infantry Division and supporting units boarded landing ships, or LSTs, in a convoy escorted by Royal Navy vessels. Unknown to them, a group of German fast attack boats, E-boats of the 9th Flotilla, had slipped into Lime Bay during the night. Armed with torpedoes and accustomed to ambushing convoys, they stumbled upon the unprotected exercise. What followed was a slaughter. 9 LSTs carried troops and equipment during the exercise. The E-boats attacked with ruthless efficiency, sinking 2 LSTs, 531 and 507, and severely damaging a third. Soldiers trapped below deck drowned as their ships went under, while others burned alive in the flames that followed torpedo strikes. Survivors jumped into the frigid waters, many weighed down by full packs and equipment. Hundreds perished not from enemy fire, but from hypothermia and exhaustion. Communication failures only worsened the chaos. Radio frequencies between the US and British forces were not properly coordinated. Some escorts had not even been assigned the same channels as the convoy. Requests for air support never reached their intended recipients. By the time the Germans withdrew, the exercise had turned into a graveyard. The casualty count, 749 American soldiers, was nearly as high as the losses sustained in some of the actual landings on D-Day. The immediate aftermath was a frenzy of secrecy. Survivors who reached shore were warned under threat of court-martial never to speak of what had happened. Bodies washed up on the beaches for days, some burned, some drowned, many unrecognizable. Yet official reports minimized the scale of the disaster, often using vague terms like training accidents or operational mishaps. Families of the dead received letters that concealed the truth, often citing routine drownings or accidents at sea. The men of Operation Tiger became invisible casualties, written out of the narrative of the war effort. Even more disturbing was the fear that sensitive information had been compromised. Among the dead were officers carrying invasion plans and details of the D-Day timetable. For several tense days, Allied command considered postponing the Normandy invasion altogether, fearing those plans had fallen into German hands. Only after it was confirmed that none of the officers' bodies had been recovered by the enemy did Eisenhower give the final go-ahead. The disaster also exposed the brutal realities of amphibious warfare training. In addition to the E-boat attack, friendly fire had claimed lives during the same exercise. On April 27th, the day before the ambush, naval bombardments were conducted with live ammunition to prepare the beaches. Poor coordination led to shells landing among troops still on shore, killing hundreds. Combined with the losses from the following day, the total death toll from Operation Tiger surpassed 900, yet only a fraction of those deaths were ever publicly acknowledged. For decades, the official story excluded the scale of the tragedy. Only in the 1970s did survivors begin to speak openly, their oaths of silence weakened by time. Even then, many faced skepticism or outright dismissal, as the governments of the United States and Britain clung to their sanitized histories. Why was Operation Tiger erased from memory? The answer lies in the absolute secrecy surrounding D-Day. The Normandy landings required deception on a scale never before attempted. Operation Fortitude, the massive disinformation campaign, convinced the Germans that the invasion would take place at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. If word of the Tiger disaster had spread, if the public learned that hundreds of American soldiers had died in a training blunder, it could have shaken confidence in the invasion. Worse, it could have provided German intelligence with hints about Allied strategies. Silence became the only option. Commanders suppressed the truth not only to protect morale, but to safeguard the greatest secret of the war. Declassified documents from the US National Archives reveal the extent of this suppression. Reports were marked top secret, with entire pages redacted for decades. Survivor testimonies were filed but never published. Even casualty lists were altered, blending Tiger deaths into general wartime losses. Only after persistent campaigning by veterans and local historians did the truth begin to resurface. In 1984, a memorial was finally erected at Slapton Sands, acknowledging the sacrifice of those who perished. But by then, most survivors were old men, their memories long dismissed, their trauma unrecognized. The tragedy of Operation Tiger underscores a chilling reality. In war, not all casualties are remembered equally. Some are celebrated in victory parades, their stories immortalized in textbooks. Others are buried beneath silence, erased to protect larger narratives. The men who drowned in Lime Bay, who burned on LST-507, who died under friendly fire on Devon's shores, were not forgotten by their comrades. But they were forgotten by history, sacrificed not only to German torpedoes, but to the politics of secrecy. Their convoy disappeared not just beneath the waters of the Channel, but beneath the archives of governments determined to keep D-Day untarnished. Today, when the winds sweep across Slapton Sands, they carry with them the whispers of a hidden disaster, a rehearsal that turned into a massacre, a file marked classified, and a truth the world was never meant to know. The war is over, yet the silence remains. 5 files, each marked by redactions and secrecy, remind us that history is never whole. Operation Highjump, a mission too large for its official explanation, returned with losses and mysteries no one dared explain. Nemmersdorf, a massacre witnessed but deliberately erased to protect fragile alliances. Unit 731, where science was built on the agony of victims, its perpetrators spared in the name of Cold War advantage. Dresden, the city of art and culture, incinerated in a firestorm not just to end a war, but to shape the next. And Operation Tiger, a rehearsal that became a catastrophe, its dead hidden beneath the legend of D-Day. These are not just stories of the past. They are warnings about the fragility of truth when power dictates memory. How many other files remain buried, locked away in archives, waiting for their seal to be broken? What truths lie in the redacted paragraphs we are never meant to read? The ghosts of these silenced events still speak, not in official histories, but in whispers, fragments, and the persistence of memory. The question is no longer what happened. It is what else they have kept from us. Leave your thoughts below, because silence too is a weapon.